what I want to do is just take a step back and think about the whole real concept behind zero trust. You would have heard a lot about it in recent years, and much of it's focused on what I think has been a very narrow remit around the actual point of access. But if you think of zero trust access as a mindset, as a concept, you can apply it much more broadly than just at the time a user is actually accessing a resource. And to me, it really comes down to what is trust about. You can never be 100% certain about anything, can you? So the whole idea of zero trust is really about minimizing risk at every point along the way. Now, some of the four key principles of zero trust as I see it are, first of all, obviously threats come from inside as well as outside. So just because somebody has been given the responsibility to carry out a task doesn't mean they might not misuse it. The other one obviously is never blindly trust, but you always want to verify, and there are different ways now that you can verify, and I'm going to be talking about that as we go along. Then one thing that I think has been really overlooked is about verifying at time of assignment. So think about when the rights, the access to a resource is actually granted to a user, okay? And there's a lot that you can do about that now. And of course, what most people think about is zero trust. It's verify at time of access itself. Now, another principle, which I think is really important. When I started my career a number of decades ago, increased security meant increased friction. And there was always that battle. Were end users going to adopt it? Were they going to look ways to bypass it? And it's incredible the way users sometimes think of bypassing the security controls that a company puts in place. So, but you don't need to do that anymore, because you now have the tools at your command to actually improve the end user experience while increasing security. Okay, so things like biometrics, things like dynamic risk analysis, and a number of other factors where you can actually increase the business efficiency, the efficiency which employees or even consumers carry out their tasks while increasing security. It's no longer an either or. Now, when you're looking at from zero trust from an identity perspective, you think of identity as a new perimeter. You're no longer confined to network boundaries, et cetera. And also you're dealing with a broad range of identities. So I'll be talking about this particularly from a workforce perspective, but you can extend these principles to consumer and B2B business partner scenarios as well. But the main categories today used for controlling identities are obviously access management, password controls, MFA, things like that. Then governance, so IGA, Identity Governance and Administration, which is policy driven, right? It's how you define the policy and the procedures by which individuals are granted access to resources. And then thirdly, privilege access management, right? Those users who have very powerful access to key resources, and therefore you have to go take that extra care, take extra steps to ensure that their rights and privileges are not misused. Now, one thing I'd point out here is that access management and privilege access management are very much about enforcement, right? Actually allowing or denying or modifying access itself. Whereas IGA is about policy, defining those policies, but that is equally important because when you look at businesses that have been granting access to identities over years and years, it can become a right mess of who has access to what, whether or not the person is even still in the company and they've changed roles, but they still have access to old applications, etc. It can become an extremely difficult to rectify and clean that up. And you really need very clear, strong policies and mechanisms and automated mechanisms to keep that safe and secure. So let's look at that identity governance aspect to start with. And there are 5 key steps, as I see it, that where you can take action to improve, well, reduce your risk. So improve your level of trust and security for your business. Now, governance means assigning the right applications with the right access, okay? It's not just, does a person have access to Salesforce or not, but what can they access? Can they only see their own deals? Can they see the whole region's deals? Can they actually go in and change price lists, et cetera? So do they have the right level of access for the applications they're granted? And are they granted it at the right time? Like I said, if you changing roles or changing responsibilities, changing teams, and having that right governance. So it's not just about having the controls at the time, but can you actually go back and review who's been assigned what? Now, the first step comes at the request stage. Somebody has to initiate the giving of that access. Now, the right way to do it now, and it's becoming more and more common, but it's probably, I wouldn't say it's the majority of companies, is that you automate it through your HR system. Because if you think about it, who is the final authority on whether or not an employee is an employee? It should be your HR department. And you don't want them to become IT administrators, but they are HR administrators. So when they assign an identity, a job role, responsibility, different attributes to a user in your HR system, that should automatically feed through to your identity provider, and to make sure that they're granted the right applications and the right access. Now, that's not the only way people get access to applications, of course. It can be through a manager granting it, even an application owner, or nowadays increasingly self-service if you've got the ability for the user to go and request access itself, and maybe that will go through some levels of approval. So where it's not automatically assigned, who has approved, granted that access? And what you really want is a system that gives you the flexibility to say, for certain applications, the manager can approve it. Or maybe for some, it'll be approved automatically. It doesn't need approval. Others may need, say that where the user licenses are expensive, where the application owner or the project owner has to approve assigning the user those rights themselves. Now, then comes the actual provisioning. Again, today, increasingly, that provisioning should happen in an automated fashion, but especially where you have legacy applications, it may require manual steps done by your service desk, by your help desk. But that should be tracked, right? To know how those access was granted and created. Now, and it's equally important that you update the user's rights when they're changing roles, changing jobs within the company, they got a promotion or simply just change regional teams and the other team uses different tools, that you remove and assign new rights appropriately. And last, and maybe most importantly, that you revoke those rights when, particularly when an employee leaves, they're not left hanging around. Now, you can't, you do have to be careful, because if you simply delete a user and application, you may lose everything that they did, right? And so you have to think before you create the policy, and it's going to differ by application, certainly email, collaboration tools. You need to assign those usually to the manager, but maybe it's going to be to a peer or somebody else, so that you don't lose those. And some systems, even where you will automatically remove the user, you can say remove them after 30 days. So the person who's been granted the access to the information has time to move it or to take over ownership of it. Okay. So those 5 basic principles of making sure you've got the right policy in place to not leave excess rights, unneeded rights to access applications and to access important business data, and that you have an overview, you can report on that, you can run an attestation campaign to see what rights different users have been granted. Okay. Now, now let's take a look at access management. When you're thinking about access, there are a number of different parameters you can look at. Think about the profile of an access attempt. So this is in real time, right? A user is sitting down at a particular device from a particular location at a particular time of day, accessing a certain resource. So what you can do now is take these parameters, you can you can automatically store those up and analyze them over time and develop a risk score based on known behavior. So sometimes this is about user and endpoint behavior analytics, it's sometimes called. And so you create a dynamic risk score. So what's the risk? How expected is this behavior for that particular access attempt? Now, it's not simply an either or the choice. It's not that, oh, I'll grant access or I'll deny access. In fact, you want to be very careful about denying access because you don't want to prevent the business from going forward. You don't want to introduce that friction. So today you have the option to introduce different authentication flows. So if you say, well, okay, the user signed in with a username and just a password, but it's from an odd location and an unknown device or a strange time of day, say, well, it's not that you want to stop them from doing their work, but you're going to enforce, say, a stronger level of MFA. So you may, for example, say, okay, I'll trust this access if they can verify with a fingerprint or face ID on their company phone. So they may be accessing from an unknown computer, but at least you know they have their phone and you've got a high level of assurance that they're who they say they are. Okay. Now, there will be times that you want to block it outright, of course. So let's say the access attempt is from a Tor browser and you say, well, I don't even care if they're a valid employee. I'm not letting them access it through the Tor network, right? So you can just do an outright block and they have to sort themselves out. They know they're trying to access the company resources outside of the security policy. But you want to have that flexibility to dynamically assign the right flow at the right time. And part of it too is if you've got a high level of assurance, right? They're accessing it from a company computer and it's at a standard time of day and they're just accessing their emails, nothing highly sensitive like a financial app or something, then you may say, well, they don't need to reinforce, they might not be prompted for MFA. You're just going to let them go in with a standard access. Now, there are other things you can do to validate the access attempt as well, right? So you can check, for example, for device trust, and that's usually the presence of a certificate on the device. So you know it's a managed device and you can have a high level of assurance with that. I mentioned you can validate MFA based on the risk score, and you can also choose which type of MFA you're going to accept. So email MFA would not be considered secure, but it's really necessary for consumers because with consumers, you don't control what devices they have. So, you're going to have to use SMS or email, something with a very low friction. But for office employees that they've got a phone, you may enforce that device level biometric MFA instead. And the other thing that really you've got no excuse not to do these days is what's called a compromised credentials check. The fact of users reusing passwords outside of work, they'll use the same password for some dodgy retail site, e-commerce site, and that gets compromised and it's out there on the dark web, and it can be purchased and easily available. Well, nowadays you can actually say when the user is, say, setting their password, you check to see if they're setting it to a known compromised, either compromised password or credential pair. And you can simply say, no, that's a compromised credential, choose a different password. Okay, very simple step, easy step, and it just reduces your exposure to people who reuse their passwords. Now, there are certain times when even if you say they have a low risk score, even if they have validated, you consider that it's very standard behavior, that you may want to challenge them. That could be for sensitive applications. So you could say, well, I don't care even if a user already has a single sign-on session but they're in the finance department and they're logging into the finance application. The data in there is too sensitive. I'm still going to challenge them for MFA when they click on their, to log into their financial application. And again, MFA is so easy for them. Now you're not really introducing friction, but you're having you're reducing the risk that somebody maybe sat down at their computer and, well, when they stepped away from the desk in the days we worked from our office, but that you're assuring that it is the person who they claim to be is accessing that application. Another really important area is when it comes to VPNs, because people do still rely on VPNs to extend trust. If you're on the VPN, you tend to have a higher level of access to certain resources where you won't be challenged. So it's really important, for example, that you enforce MFA when a user logs in to their VPN, because you need that. You need to reduce the risk that it's a bad actor, that it's somebody who has obtained compromised credentials. And the other thing is revoking access when a user is finished. Now, there are some standards out there, what's called single logout, right? So it's the opposite of single sign-on. Unfortunately, a lot of applications don't actually enforce it, but a good identity provider will support that and can sign you out of those applications that do support it. Okay. Now, when it comes to session management, a lot of it still, the control resides with the application. So even if you've federated those applications using standards like SAML and OIDC with your identity provider, the identity provider might not be able to control and terminate those sessions. So think carefully about the default session length that you assign in the application, because really it's the application that creates the session cookie, and how they create it, they can override whatever the identity provider tells them to set. Okay, so I would think that by standard you wouldn't want it longer than a business day. Maybe restricted to 8 hours, and for more sensitive applications, once salespeople are back on the road again, you might want to restrict, say, the Salesforce session to half an hour or an hour. A little bit annoying in terms of them, having to refresh the page and log in again, but you want to minimize the risk that that session is taken over. So when it comes to applying zero trust to access, the 5 principles of analyze the risk in real time, so dynamic risk score, assign the right authentication flow, validate it on more than just MFA, look at other parameters for validating it, decide which applications or which users should be challenged when they access certain resources, and also make sure wherever possible you can revoke that access, again, in real time, a user logs out of your identity provider, they can log them out of those active sessions. Now, the last area I want to look at is privileged access. Now, I think the principles of zero trust have been applied to privileged users, for a longer time than for other types of users, for obvious reasons, simply because of the importance that they have in terms of the resources they can access. Now, the old principle was administrators were granted administrative rights. And as long as they were in that job, they had those rights all the time, whether they were logged in or not, whether they're working or not, on holiday or not. But if you think about it, that's very risky. So if their identity is compromised, then your entire estate is open up. So one way, that you can get around that is to actually have time-bound granting of access when it's needed. Okay, and again, the tools are there for you today so that you can, an administrator will request the access they need to perform a certain task. And the rights to do that will be assigned for a time-limited period. When I say time-limited, it may be just for 2 hours, for example. And if it's particularly high level of access, then that may require a manager to approve that beforehand. So if a Linux administrator says they need to run some commands as using sudo or root access, tomorrow, they request that today for a certain 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Email gets sent to the manager. The manager not only has to approve it, but has to perform MFA to approve it. And then at 2 p.m., the administrator can log in and perform those actions. Now, and then when the user completes that or the time limit comes up, those are revoked. There's no longer any association between the administrator and those rights. All right. Now, this is perfectly possible to do today with privileged users. Perhaps at some, I think it's too much to expect to extend that beyond, but certainly for privileged users, it's something that I think you should seriously consider, along with your standard PAM governance that you would have, where you have full auditing of all the sessions. And in fact, nowadays you can do even stricter enforcement where you can monitor what commands are run. So they may be granted general root access, but if they perform certain Linux commands, you could actually block it, or again, say it's prevented from happening until the manager approves it, right? Or until the administrator who has that access performs MFA, so you know it's actually them. So there's quite a bit of control that you can have, but I think that time-limited access just reduces the window by which you exposed if there's a bad actor in your system. Simply by them taking over one of those admin personas, they're not going to get access to perform those risky actions. So when it comes to PAM, look, checking out credentials, seeing if those actions need approval, provisioning those in real time, making sure you're monitoring it, and obviously deprovisioning when it's done. So, I just coming up to the end of our time, just have a few minutes left. So maybe I'll just open it up to questions now. If anybody wanted to ask anything about this.
The time-bound access.
Yes.
For a break glass situation, I can see the time-bound access working for sort of routine maintenance type of work. If the system's gone down, the system admin needs to get in on the system to bring the services back up for one reason or another. That process that you described might hinder recovery of that system in a timely manner.
Yes, I mean there are ways you can design that. In terms of who has to perform the approval. and the ability to have more than one person do the approval, or yeah. So, and also you could say that standard admin access from has to go through that approval, but if it's coming from a specific IP address or whatever, then it can bypass that.
Yeah.
Right. So you can design it so you're relying on traditional perimeter control for non-standard access, but you're giving the flexibility that you've got your tech ops team working from home or different locations, not in the office, etc.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, but you definitely need to take all of that into consideration when you design your policy. Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks very much. Happy to talk to you after the session if you have any more questions, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.